Hello, and welcome to Informatics in the Round. I'm Kevin Johnson. This is my podcast, where we discuss hot topics in informatics so that, as we say, anyone can get it. This month, we have a really fun podcast in store. Daniel Fabry, who is a professor of biomedical informatics at Vanderbilt and a computer scientist, is joined by Shannon Rich, who many of you might remember as our funny and irreverent friend from podcast number 1, and a really excellent songwriter in town whose name is Jane Bach. And the four of us have a really good time discussing the challenges of deploying interesting technology and innovations in the informatics space into clinical practice. Jane was great for this. She's a native New Yorker, and you'll be able to know immediately that she's a New Yorker as soon as she starts talking. But she's actually been in Nashville since 1982 as a songwriter, and is one of the true award-winning hit songwriters who's had a chance to record with people like Tammy Wynette and Reba McEntire and Colin Ray and Jody Messina and lots of other people. She's had a #1 record called The Last One to Know with Reba McEntire, and has done a number of other things that you'll hear about. But most importantly, she's a teacher who has actually written a workbook for new songwriters called Songwriting and the Music Business. And you can tell that she's a teacher in the insightful way she asks questions that Daniel and Shannon and I try to answer. Jane and Shannon were kind of a great dynamic duo, and they really pushed us to talk in depth about a lot of things we weren't planning to talk about, which I think is going to be a theme in every single episode of this podcast. We started talking about deploying innovations, but it's pretty clear that when you start talking about deploying innovations into practice, you have to start getting into issues related to what if they're wrong, how much do you trust technology, how much do you trust information, does machine learning in some way make you more or less willing to trust the results that come out of it? Are data sets themselves biased, and should that somehow impact trust? And then things that even related to how personal data should be used for research, or whether we should be requiring that personal data be reused for research. Yes, we talked a little bit about cancer. We got into a pretty serious topic, but we also talked a little bit about the President of the United States, arguably a much less serious topic, depending on your perspective. So without any further ado, let's get into this conversation.
Okay, everybody, welcome to Informatics in the Round. We have an exciting episode today. Remember that the goal of Informatics in the Round is informatics so my mother can understand it. And my mom can't be here, but instead I have our favorite person, Shannon Rich. So Shannon, welcome. I hear you have a guest or two.
Hi, Kevin. I did. I brought a friend of mine with me today. Her name is Jane Bach, and that's her husband, Gary.
Gary, say hi.
And
Gary, say a word or two.
hi, Gary.
You can say
Say
something.
hi. You can actually speak.
I can actually speak?
Yeah. So Jane and I have been friends since 1996.
Mm-hmm.
And she is very well known in this town.
Oh, God.
Wow.
Infamous.
Infamous.
What does she do in this town to make her well known, just to be clear?
Hanging out with me.
Okay. Got it. Not really.
That kind of tainted her rep, but she is a songwriter. She's had a lot of #1 hits and publishing deals for years here, and she knows about songwriting in the round. So,
Well, excellent.
I'm so glad she came with me.
And you
I'm
started.
glad you asked. I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, our guest today, in addition to you two, is Dan Fabry. Dan Fabry is a PhD faculty member here within the department. And how would you describe your research interests and professional interests?
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My professional interests are essentially applying machine learning using clinical data to improve the way we treat patients in the world today. So how do we make sick patients better using computers, data, and technology?
Do you understand that?
Not a word.
Okay, we'll get into it.
Okay, come on. You got to make it work better. This is the goal.
What is machine learning?
That's where you lost me.
Okay. When you go outside in the morning and you see it's wet on the ground, do you think it's rained?
Yes.
Okay. So machine learning and predicting something that, is going to happen is not something that's new. We've been doing it for eons and generations, right? Are the fields going to have enough water to rain? And we'll look at the temperature. We'll look at, did it rain yesterday? Are there clouds coming in? So that's kind of just like predicting what's going to happen tomorrow.
So it's the ability of a computer to learn?
Yeah, it's the ability to use a computer using historical data sets to
Okay.
learn from past patterns. For example, if it continues to see Nigerian prints and someone says, hey, this is spam, it learns from those patterns, hey, this is likely spam going forward.
Got it.
So that's machine learning on something you're familiar with. Now, when I said, using this data to improve treatment, well, what does all that mean? So, right, in the last decade, you've used Netflix for machine learning to predict and recommend your favorite videos, or Amazon to recommend and say, hey, you should really buy those slippers, right? You probably did that for the Christmas time period. But what we're now talking about is how do we use those same type of tools that recommended slippers or recommended movies to now help predict.
So does it have to do with patterns?
It does.
Wow.
Okay.
You're getting this.
So,
I'm not as dumb as I look.
But so what's the
And
difference?
for the record, I just want to say, you don't look dumb.
Oh,
So
thank
go ahead.
you.
Keep going.
So I have a question about that. How long does it take for you to learn from that data? So if you predict, for instance, that I should have diabetes and I never get it, how long does it take you to put that information back into your model?
Sure. Well, let's talk about how you actually get that. So that's what's called labeling. So machine learning, often in this case, is called, I'll use quotes here, supervised machine learning. It has a label. It says, has cancer or not cancer. Well, guess where we get that? Much like someone's rating one of your songs and saying they like it or don't like it on Pandora, what someone is doing for medical chart review is they're saying, yes, this person has cancer, they don't have cancer, by reading through every individual chart one by one and saying, yes, they have cancer and they don't have cancer. So it takes a lot of time, as you can imagine, but it's reading pages and pages of clinical notes to help say, yes, this person has cancer and they don't have cancer.
So then you're not talking about a predictive factor. In other words, that someone can get cancer by virtue of certain patterns, but that they actually have it.
Well, that's what we're trying to do, is we look historically on past medical charts from the last decade or two and say, from all this information, did they have cancer or not after some period of time? And then we look back and say, once we found out they had cancer or not, we look back and use that information to say, what patterns can we use from that historical data to predict cancer? Did they have a specific type of gene? Did they have various types of phenotypes or symptoms for which that they're experiencing?
And can you not have all of these patterns and symptoms and predictive qualities and still not get cancer?
Oh, yeah. So, one of the biggest challenges we have today is it's often a probabilistic model. It says from...
Probably. This might happen.
That's it.
Probably might happen. It ranges from 0 to 1, but, in the real world, are we ever really certain?
So it's not a crystal ball. It's
No.
not where you can look and have an actuality or something that's concrete. It's just, you know what, this is...
That's right.
If this probability does not happen, right? If you've aggregated all of my data from my medical record and you suggest that I should have whatever, cancer, and I don't get that, where in your process are you going back to see?
Sure.
So how is that being received by the fire department personnel? Are they
As long as
hesitant or are they?
So one, in the Nashville fire case, we're actually not recording video, so we're not actually recording who's doing what. We only actually do catch accelerometer data in there. But two, their response is anything that can improve our way in which we do care, that's fantastic, right? As long as it doesn't interrupt how they do care, right?
So what's an accelerometer data?
Thank you.
An accelerometer
I couldn't pronounce it.
is an
It sounds like
accelerometer is
something
like
for the
what's in your
Jetsons.
Apple Watch.
It does. It does. It is.
It's so an accelerometer measures the motion, for example, of your arm. As you turn your Apple Watch around and around and up and down, it measures motion.
Right.
And so,
Oh.
if you're doing CPR
Accelerometer, I got
and your
it.
hands are moving up and down, that gives an
Got it.
acceleration signature of that your hands are going up and down. And there's only so many procedures you can be doing in the back of an ambulance that correlate to that
right.
motion. And so, intubation.
Is it bad that I just went to another place with that?
Sure.
Where were you going? I
It was
always
bad.
worry. Okay,
You
then
should.
it's probably bad. Sorry. Back to accelerometer.
I can tell by the blush on his face. He knows exactly where I went.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
People do use technology for various alternative purposes.
All that makes sense. Sort of?
Actually, surprisingly, it is totally making
Not
sense to
surprisingly.
me.
Not surprisingly. So, what's really interesting about this and why it relates to the point, Shannon, you were making earlier is if I'm a doctor and this guy comes to me with this really interesting whatever, that let's just use a probabilistic model, and I try it out on you, and it doesn't predict the thing that you and I thought it might be predicting, or it says that you are at risk for something, but it actually never happens.
Right.
Does that bother you? Is that different than the weatherman saying we're going to have rain tomorrow, but it doesn't rain?
Well, the weatherman's gotten a lot better in the last few years, right, as technology's improved. But it doesn't bother me from a patient care. It makes me curious. So how long does it take you to say, in your predictive model, this prediction didn't pan out? Does it immediately feed back into that machine learning? And then what do you glean out of it to go back and say, how do I make this sharper? How do I make this more accurate?
Maybe you're just stopping too soon. I mean,
so let me try this because this is actually
does
a really
my question
important
even
point.
make sense?
It's one of the hardest questions in the world today.
Right. So here's
well,
part of the answer. So
ha-ha.
let's say that the weatherman is right 95% of the time.
Yeah.
What's that mean?
It means that 95% of the time I know whether I want to take my dog outside or not.
Okay, so the weatherman says that was terrible. No. So the weatherman predicts that there is going to be a tornado today. And you take your dog out and it's completely clear. Is the weatherman wrong?
I mean, he's not correct, right?
Okay, so
But
24 hours have passed. There was no tornado. Was the weatherman wrong?
what happened in the atmospheric conditions?
Let's just say yes, he was
Yes,
wrong.
he was.
He was
Okay,
totally
Kevin,
wrong.
he was
So
wrong.
does that mean that you've never listened to the weatherman again?
No.
Why not?
Absolutely not.
He's wrong.
Because he's right 95% of the time.
Exactly. So the point is that 5 out of every 100 times, you expect him to be wrong, and you've decided that was okay, right?
Right.
So the question to ask Dan really is, when you do these predictions, how many times can you be wrong before nobody would like to use your tool where they find it useless? If the weatherman was wrong 50% of the time, that means every day you could do a coin flip and do almost as well as the weatherman. Possibly exactly the same as the weatherman, right? So there's a point at which I can either listen to the weather or I can say rain, heads, it's tails, no rain today. And I'll be about as right as I was listening to the weatherman. So what's the right answer? How accurate do we have to be?
So, I mean, let's just take the example of what Google came out with just a couple days ago. They had this big paper in Nature that said the new AI system, quote unquote, artificial intelligence system that they just came out with can detect breast cancer more accurately than physicians. And so
Gary was just telling me about that. That is so weird. On the way in, he was just telling me that he had read that.
The guy is smart.
So,
he is.
One of the most basic question we often answer is, can a machine learning or AI system perform in an equivalent manner to a human doing that same job, right? And so that's often the quote-unquote gold standard that we often try to replicate. Now, the benefit of a computer doing that is it can do it faster or potentially with less subjectivity than a human. The downside of that is, well, what happens if it gets wrong? Do you want it to act?
Well, doesn't a human program that information in to begin with?
Will somebody call on me?
Shannon. She's raising her hand.
Oh my God, she raised her
When in
hand.
her life has she
She
ever
must
raised
want
her
more
hand?
wine.
So the answer to that is yes. A person came up with that requirement, a person programmed that requirement, a person QA'd that requirement, and a person pushed it out into the wild on that requirement. So
But
if they mess that up in any one of those steps,
then you're
So,
screwed.
but here's I think this is one of the biggest and most important things to come out of the last 5 years of research in computer science, is that it used to be that we programmed all these rules of how to detect breast cancer. It used to be we had these definitions and statistics we used to run. What's changed in the last 5 years is we've now flipped it to say, this is cancer, this is not cancer, and we haven't actually told the system what the rules are for cancer. It learns by itself.
Well, that's
So-
scary. I'm sorry.
So that's
pretty
the big
scary.
diff-
That's what's his name, Hal in Space Odyssey or whatever
Or
that movie was
Skynet.
called.
It's all that.
Yeah,
So
And we're going to have a whole episode about this particular issue.
I'm seriously
Which is-
going to have to be listening to your podcast.
Seriously, so before this she was lying. But now she's really
I mean, this
telling
is
the truth.
really well. I think it's also the fact that, of course, it's complicated. And I know nothing about any of this, but it's not that difficult to wrap my brain around it.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? As long as you have someone like Dan who's explaining it properly, I think that that has a lot to do with it.
She's my smart friend, not only my talented songwriting friend.
There it is.
But
Worldly.
Worldly,
She's been to the Bluebird and the Wild Horse. Right.
I
And
have
Third
never
Lindsley.
played at the Wild Horse. Never.
So, but speaking about horses, like, one of the classic examples here is horses versus zebras, right?
There you go.
All we do now in these new types of machine learning is we don't actually tell it the rules of how to differentiate a horse and a zebra, black and white versus whatever color of horse. We just say that's a horse, that's a zebra, and the system learns by itself how to differentiate it. And that's what's kind of the big revolution. You don't have to mentally write down the rules to differentiate one horse from a zebra. You just tell it this is this and this is that, and
Well,
it learns
now
itself.
how does this, what we're talking about right this very second, relate to predicting something happening?
The same type of analogy can be expanded to cancer. We just say this person has cancer, this person doesn't have cancer. We look at all the clinical notes, for example, of their past history to say how the patient progressed, what medications they had, what imaging was their specific lesions or whatever it may be in their CAT scans or MRI imaging. And from that historical example, it learns, much like black and white for zebras versus horses, it learns, if it has these types of words and these type of structures in the image, this person is likely going to progress to cancer. And so one of the biggest challenges we face is you might not care how the system differentiates horses and zebras.
Just that it does.
That it does. You just care that it gets it right.
Right.
But one of the biggest questions that we face in this informatics healthcare space today is, do we care about the interpretability of these machine learning systems? Do we care why the system, what inputs did the system use to make its decision?
And does it matter whether you care or not?
Do you want the best prediction for your cancer?
Right, because this is what he called it interpretability. People will also call it explainability. So let me ask you this question, because this is a question you guys can answer that we can't. So your doctor sends an alert to you saying that we think this medication you're on may be causing a side effect. We can't tell you exactly why, but we want you to stop the medicine. Are you okay with that?
No. No, I would want to know what it is that made you think that.
But what if we can't tell you?
And
What if we know
but
we're almost always right, but we can't explain to you what the variables are?
Well, generally, now we get into something trust factor. Normally if you trust your doctor, okay, Gary just is going through cancer right now as we speak. And we trust his doctor. And so when his doctor says to him, it wasn't another tumor, it turned out to be just lesions on the back wall of your bladder, and I cleaned them out and it's clear. It's gone, you're clear. Do I trust that, or do I now have to get somebody else?
Right.
You know what I'm saying, to verify that. So here it's the same thing. If my doctor calls me and says, look, the medication I've been giving you, I think that maybe you're going to end up with side effects from it. My first question would be, why do you think that? What makes you think that?
And what
that
if the,
would be
what,
my
what if the
first
response
question.
is, well, 100 other people like you had those side effects as well?
Well, then I would probably say, then give me something that you have, you think has a less chance of giving me side effects.
So that's interesting. So that's not an explanation. That's just data to say the system is telling us, it's the weatherman. This system is telling us that 98% of the time, when it says it has you have this side effect, you're going to have it. You're okay with that answer? Because this fundamentally is what slows down the kind of research that many of us do in informatics.
The fact that I would be okay with that is a problem.
No.
Oh.
The fact that some of the best, and again, the fact that some of the best techniques that we have these hidden layers, and it's impossible to know because they're hidden how they work, and therefore we can't really tell you what they're doing, but they do it really, really well, is sometimes enough that most people in medicine say, well, if we can't explain it, we can't give it to patients.
Oh, I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, just because you can't explain something, I can't explain certain things that happen, physically, that happen in a day, but I know that they're going to happen, or that they happen. I know that if the sun comes out and I stand under the sun, that I get sunburned. Can I give you an actual explanation of how I know, why that's going to happen? No, I'm not a scientist. I can't tell you. But I know it's happened because I know from my experience that if I stand out in the sun, without anything on, I'm going to get sunburn.
But now let's say there's no scientist that can provide that interpretability for you. Does that?
Then I would have to rely on my own personal data, my own experience with it. If you're telling me as a doctor, if you're saying to me, I can't give you the actual scientific data why this is going to happen, but I'm telling you there's a probability that it will happen, I would probably listen to that. I would be okay with that.
So it sounds like the first step is not to be Shannon and be hypercritical of every single human being on the planet, but instead to actually trust
To be
your
Why
doctor.
I Am Single, chapter 438.
So true, so true.
Well, I mean,
Well,
I
this-
can
this
I
is
can
really
understand someone wanting more detailed information. I can understand that, but to me, there are certain things that are beyond my ken. I don't, even if you explain them to me, it wouldn't make any difference.
So this is where like traditional clinical trials come in, right? So we, in a traditional clinical trial for a new type of cancer drug, for example, we do a case and control where some cancer patients get the drug and some get a placebo, and then we see the survival rates.
Right.
The challenge with that is that those studies are very time intensive, costly, and take a long time to evaluate their success rate. And so there seems to be a huge opportunity for some of these machine learning and AI systems to improve care. But if each one has to go through the same type of rigorous clinical trial process, do we limit the progress we could have in providing care going forward? And so there exists some threshold. Some type of clinical trials are needed for if I give you a new type of drug. Mm-hmm. But if I make a recommendation system of, hey, you might want to try this different type of drug, that might not need a full clinical trial. And so there's some cutoff between...
But to me, hey, you might need this other drug is the clinical trial.
It's-
Then you're using me as a guinea pig, and
It seems like there's a lot of gray area between those two things, right? What's a clinical trial?
And implicitly,
And
there's
what's
risk.
not.
There's an implicit risk to the patient, right? The greater the risk and the more drastic a change to normal clinical practice, the more likelihood you probably need a full clinical trial. In contrast, if you're just recommending a decision, but then still keeping the physician in the loop, for example, having the physician, the system recommends, much like Netflix says, hey, I think you'll like this Brad Pitt movie
based
because
on what you've
you liked Brad Pitt before.
Right.
Like now it's saying to the doctor, hey, I think you should think about having this patient stop this medication. But the doctor makes that final determination.
Right. That was my next thing. It's that there's always a human element involved, even with AI, whether it's the human that's inputting the information to begin with. We were talking about this the other day. If that human makes a mistake at the very beginning, then everything that AI computes is going to be wrong.
And that's a great segue, because it turns out that's the notion of what's called bias. The whole idea that I have a data set. The data set is based on you guys as my patients, me putting things in the system. And if I've never really selected for a representative population of patients, let's just say all my patients are middle-class white men, you take my data, you analyze it, it says that there's a pretty good chance that this drug is going to cause a side effect in you. Dr. Fabry, who's now an MD, I've just made you see that promotion. You see that?
Now, you can ask my wife that.
Yeah, says, okay, my augmented intelligence agent has told me that you are at risk for this side effect. You need to stop the medicine. Neither of us is aware. You're not aware. He's not aware that my data set was biased. It included no women.
Exactly.
But didn't that happen with Ambien?
Tell me about that.
Ambien, if I'm the only one that knows this, when it was first prescribed...
If not, we'll just say it's another joke you're making.
Okay, all right. When it was first prescribed, they found out years later that they were way over prescribing women by giving them the same dose that they were giving men. And it had to do with the fact that the clinical trials used men subjects way more than women. So you can Google that and look that up, but I'm just telling you.
Before it gets out into the world, I will have done that.
He will do that.
So if I'm wrong about this, you'll never have heard me say that, because Kevin
unless it's an
won't let
outtake and I decide to put it on the
So in
website.
other words, if you say to me,
I
Jane,
do remember that though.
based on my data, you need to stop taking this medication and try this medication. I need to say to you, well, what in your trials did you try it on women my age? How many women my age as opposed to how many men? And, you know, I mean, were
Yeah.
they musicians? Did they, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
what is it that makes you think? So now I would say to you, knowing what we're talking about now, I would say to you, well, what are you basing your information on?
And,
What?
and to make this problem even worse, there's a lot of pieces of information that we don't know that go into this. There's some drugs, for example, that sunlight exposure can cause, you know, severe burns. And if I only find out that all these patients didn't have burns because they all work in the coal mines,
Yeah.
and then you go and give the same medication to a population...
A lifeguard. Exactly.
You would never have collected that data in the first place.
In the first place.
And so...
Whoa, it's very convoluted, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, like, I'm
Jane,
trying to
do you
wrap...
want it? Are you tempted like I am to give Dan all your medical data?
I mean, so that's actually one of the biggest questions today, right?
Wow.
How much do you want your personal data
Oh,
used
well.
for clinical research and in training these systems?
If that's the only place that we're going,
Mm-hmm.
then I wouldn't mind my medical data being used because it's for the greater good, and I wouldn't mind that. But if that information is getting out somewhere else, I would mind.
So what's the difference there? Explain to me how you differentiate getting out.
Well, of course, if I were younger and I were
How
thinking,
could you be any younger than 25?
I know, I don't know. Who, you know.
Yeah, I've known her since she was 2.
If and I were thinking of a career,
Yeah.
okay? And there's certain information, if it gets out and an employer finds out about it,
Like
they
if your
wouldn't
smoking
hire
status
me.
is wrong on your electronic medical record.
That could
Well-
never happen.
I mean, yes, if you smoke or whatever, I don't, but if you smoke or whatever, but other things, I have asthma, I have chronic asthma. I mean, there might be people who say, well, you know, she's going to end up missing work. She's going to, you know, she's not a good bet. She's not someone that we may want to hire. And so I wouldn't want to...
So the reselling of health data scares you.
Oh, God, yes. The reselling of any data scares
Okay,
me.
but the use of hospitals using that data to improve care
that wouldn't
locally.
bother me. No, that wouldn't bother me.
What about the next step of multiple hospitals coming together to build? You know, we just talked about the example of, you know, you have one group of patients in the South that have diabetes risk, and then another set of patients in the Northeast that have a different disposition for diabetes. What's your thoughts about then combining those two populations together to build an even better diabetes prediction system?
Well, isn't that what we would want to do? Is that the wrong answer? Is to be able to gather as much information as possible in order to make an intelligent determination, I would think.
Sure.
You need, knowledge is power, so...
But how much of the data that you're collecting in an electronic medical record end up with the insurance company?
Oh, there's another thing.
So then...
The data right now, the data are that most of the insurance companies or payers already have access to more data than you.
I'm aware.
And so the real question here is, can you live with the idea that in addition to the insurance company, other people may have access to your data?
Well, if the insurance companies have access to that data, you can guarantee that other people have access to the data. I'm willing to bet.
And just to give you an example, so Gary has cancer, as you've mentioned.
Yes.
And of course...
Well, right now he's cancer-free.
Congratulations. Okay, that deserves applause. Okay.
I get the official word Monday.
Yes.
Okay,
Monday.
so the fact of the matter is, I guarantee you that the therapy that you were on was based on a protocol that came from the kinds of data that Dan or I or others need to do machine learning. It's just that it was not de-identified, likely, and it was joined with as much data as possible to figure out what other patients received and how they did long term. And then they used that to decide a few things, but without getting into a lot of details, whether the average patient like Gary is close enough to Gary that he should get the same protocol, or whether Gary has some particular variables that they probably tested the first day or two that would suggest he's not like the patients in the protocol and therefore has to go off the protocol to get different drugs. Or maybe even the same drugs, but with a different dosing
dosages.
exactly,
Right.
And so all of that required a lot of patients just like you to say to their providers, I want my data to go for the greater good.
Right, and I have no problem with that. But now, of course, the insurance company has access to all of that data.
They already did.
Oh, no, I know they do. I could tell that by when I get the quarterly, from the insurance company when they say this is what was paid or what Medicare paid or what our, other
But
insurance
how much
paid.
different would it be from a clinical perspective and a data collection perspective if people did not fear having some type of retribution toward them for data that they supplied? And that's what you're hearing from her is, I don't mind giving my data for the greater good. I just don't want it used against me.
So do you hear this when you look at groups of data that you're trying to use for machine learning?
Yeah, and so that there's a couple ways that people deal with this. One is de-identifying your data, right? The data that you give doesn't actually get used in its raw form. Your name, your birth date, your address are all removed or de-identified, and then when
So it's given a number.
It's given a random number,
right.
and from there people can use that, but actually not tie it back to you.
Mm-hmm.
That's one type of de-identification. Another type is instead of giving individual patient records, researchers get the counts or frequencies by which a medication and a cancer diagnosis occurred together, or this drug and this lab result occurred together. Mm-hmm. And so that's a different way that data can be shared. And so there's all these different flavors of ways that people try to mask or hide different values to try to help people share data. But it's still challenging.
Well, it is challenging, and there's still the element of my data is still being used in there, and I just want to make sure that it's fine for the research part of it, but that it's not going to get out anywhere else. It's kind of like when you have a child in school and that child is having discipline
Don't
issues.
talk about me.
No, discipline issues, let's
Sure,
say.
yep.
And the mother says, well, I think maybe he's got ADHD or something. Man, that is not something you want the school to know if that's not the case. And sometimes it's not even anything you want the school
Sure.
to know,
And this
period.
expands into the
It
military.
follows with them for the rest of their lives.
But I mean, the thing about it is that I think from a societal perspective, the concern is, I don't mind you using any of my data for anything you want, as long as you don't make me pay for it. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to go to The Hague because you took my DNA and my personality and saw my Twitter account and said, get this woman in the prison.
Got it.
Right?
Yep,
I mean,
yep.
that's the thing. I don't mind you having all of that.
It won't take your
information.
DNA. We already have enough on you.
I
But
know.
that's okay.
I know.
Okay, I want to ask another question because
Okay.
we're really covering some deep stuff here, but I want to make sure that
It's the wine.
but no, it's important stuff. So, and Jane's not drinking wine.
No,
so what's
Jane's
her
drinking
excuse?
water.
She's just her wine is life.
It's me.
It's just infused with life. So one of the hardest things that I know Dan does here is he takes all of this into consideration, and then he tries to get groups of people to actually use the technologies he builds. Because believe it or not, in our department here, we have papers of really interesting insights that never get seen by patients. So what is it that you do to get things deployed? How do you get things from, I think it's an idea, to, I got to get it in front of patients?
Yeah, I mean, so this is the side of healthcare technology that many people don't see. It's, you have, just like starting a small business or, starting something small, and a lot of it's just perseverance and pushing it through. You have some small idea, you write some paper, you publish some results, and then it's going through the bureaucracy of approvals to try to get it out into the world and say, hey, I think this is a good idea. I think we can get cancer patients detected earlier. I think we can help neonatal intensive care patients get out of the hospital faster and more safe. Going through that process takes time, right? You have to get the appropriate resources. You have to pull the right data. You have to get all the appropriate consents or research protocols put in place such that we can do this and release these tools into the public in a safe manner, but at the same time try to push the boundaries on new approaches for deploying
How do you
technology.
expedite that?
The biggest thing is to take it from a one-off process of deploying these tools in healthcare to making it a repeatable, regular process where going to deploy the next tool no longer takes a year. It's just one piece, one new step, because you've already laid the foundation for deploying these systems and having the appropriate controls in place in the environment.
So it's basically, talk about repetition, it's basically the same thing as determining if you are prone to having cancer because you've created a pattern.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Or like when you're writing music, I'm guessing I mean, maybe you're really lucky and you show up at a round and you start writing a song and it's good. But also, like, you go one time, two times, you get more comfortable, you find a group of people you can kind of feed off of, and after that, the fifth time is just easier, sixth time or seventh or 10th, because you've learned kind of
Right.
develop the
things.
pathway.
Yeah.
Right. Things get easier the more you do them.
And
But I was thinking
That
more
has
into-
not worked out for me with marriages.
Oh,
I'm just
well.
going to say that doesn't apply to everything. But anyway, go
interesting.
Now, one thing I do want to ask, I guess, because back maybe a half hour ago, when you were asking your question, I actually thought you were asking, well, how long do you wait for somebody to get the cancer? Let's say you predict that somebody is going to get cancer. How long do you wait for them to get it before you say, okay, this didn't work?
Or feedback the result of you didn't get cancer, feed it back to improve the model.
Right.
Exactly, but maybe it's not that she's not going to get cancer. She just hasn't got it yet. Maybe, it's kind of like success and failure.
Well,
So
we have a great example of this. So one of our faculty actually has this model which allows you to predict suicide. But then the question you have to ask yourself is, what do? Do you admit these patients to the hospital for the rest of their life to prove that it's not going to happen? Which, by the way,
Exactly
it
my
won't?
point.
Right.
How long do you
It's
wait?
a Tom Cruise movie. What's it?
Minority Report.
Oh, the Minority Report.
Right.
Right.
Gosh, I'm so far behind on movies and TV.
Oh,
This
it's
is like
an
20
old
years ago.
movie.
I was going to say, you are way behind now.
It's an old movie.
So I have to show you guys something. So
What?
the people who are listening to this can't see it, but Shannon, what am I holding?
It is a teddy bear with the brown nose and black eyes, and it's blonde.
Isn't he adorable?
And
It's
I
cute.
love it.
So I had this research project, and he'll be able to talk about this. It was called, this is the teddy bear that we called the Medi Teddy. The idea was that the Medi Teddy, well, here, I'll let it talk to you.
Hi, I'm MediTeddy. I can help you with your medications. Press the help button on the screen to find out more about me.
And then, let me see if this is
Well,
gonna
he's
work.
kind of cute.
So watch this.
Where is their
So now
screen?
imagine, supposing you have a little belly pain.
Oh, I'm so sorry you hurt there. Sometimes the medicines can cause that. I'll make sure we remember.
So the idea was you could use that feedback, plus you could actually use the fact that you know where they pushed to send a message to the electronic health record that said the patient is reporting abdominal
Stomach
side
pain.
effect or stomach pain with the medicine. Right?
Maybe what you should have done with the rash was scratched its arm. Maybe.
Well, somewhere in here I can't find it. There was one that has a headache, and these were all prototypes. Yes, you can hold my teddy bear, Shannon. Don't mess with this
There's
tail.
nothing on its tail.
Right. So guess what happened
Oh,
to
it's
this?
so cute.
Nothing.
Nothing.
No. Right.
And the
It
reason
doesn't
is
do-
because of the challenges that we have with
Wow.
deployment. We made prototypes. We tried to get them out. We recognized that there were other companies that were sort of doing similar things. And that's what you're expert in. This is what didn't you have a grant that kind of dealt with some of these translational issues?
Yeah, I mean, part of my entire career has been taking some of this stuff, getting off the shelf, and also just starting to spin out companies. Sometimes, an academic setting may not be the best place to launch stuff. In some cases, you need to spin out technology into companies and have the company
corporate. You need
you know,
something corporate.
Well, I mean, academic institutions are fantastic for research, but they probably aren't the best institutions for coming up with good marketing, good customer support in terms of product and design and purchasing products and deployment. And so that's one of the things that we've been focusing on is how do we spin out technology from the stuff we invent.
Did you try going? I mean, listen to me. Did you try going to Mattel or Hasbro or any of the toy companies? See if they wanted to get involved.
I mean, not the toys were not my thing. I don't know that Kevin can talk about that, but we talk. There's becoming more and more like an app environment. Like iPhones have apps for your phone. There's now starting to be more app environments on the EMR systems. But one of the biggest things that we find, with the teddy bear example, or even your Fitbit or any of these devices, is that there's a period of time when the person is engaged and involved, and then it's no longer an immediate concern, and then it kind of decays off in their interest. And so one of the biggest challenges is how do we consistently and constantly have health technology work to improve patient care while the patient's care the patient's own interest in that care declines.
Well,
as
the patients don't care.
Well, the patients don't care.
Exactly.
Well, or they feel, or to be precise, they feel better.
They
Right.
feel better. Right.
You know, if you're feeling better, why are you going to log every dose you
wouldn't.
take or whatever it may be, unless you have to?
And all of this is actually why you have to do studies, because, for example, the MediTeddy idea morphed into an application that runs on an iPhone, and it was very successful. But what we learned was, even though it worked, after a few weeks, kids stopped using it. And if I were to ask you if you've ever used Weight Watchers or any of these technologies or tried to quit smoking, many people try to do these things. It's going along great, and then they just stop. And there's a whole field called behavioral economics that's also a part of what we think about, which is how do I help you make behavior change by giving you variable levels of inducements so that as you get further and further along, there's a different reason why you want to keep playing. It's also called game theory.
Right.
And there's that whole strategy of how you take something that Dan has built and deploy it, which he's also an expert in.
And when you say inducement, you're not just referring to giving birth to a new product, right?
That would be induction,
Okay.
but yes, you're right. See, everybody wants to be a comedian, right? So listen, this has been unbelievably useful for me. Do you have any questions that remain?
Interesting. Really interesting.
It's really interesting, and the wine was good.
Thank you. And I learned a lot. I mean, I think the key thing we talked about a lot here is just these data and how much they matter, and machine learning and what it's all about, and some of the nuances around great ideas that Dan and his team might have that if we can't explain it a certain way or don't get the right level of trust, don't get out. And that's a big part of what we think about in what we call
because
translation.
I always feel like the most important thing is information.
Yes.
I mean, and as a patient, I want to have the most information that I can get. I don't want to have too much information because sometimes, like I just did, it's way over my head, and
You did great.
and it's confusing. But what?
Will his mom get it?
Oh, well, if I got it, his mother will get it. I mean, I'm
Well,
somebody.
That's all
Mom,
you
if you're
need.
listening, congratulations, you should get this.
will get this.
That'll be the first conversation over the Thanksgiving table that I don't have to repeat more than once.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So listen, speaking of information, I remember hearing some information about you being a songwriter
Oh, I
and
am.
us being in the round.
We are in the round.
Would
This
you be
is-
willing to play a song for us?
Well, you know what? I just happen to have a guitar with me.
That's
Do you
how
want me to
about-
play it?
Do you
No.
I don't know. Do you play guitar?
No.
Oh.
Well,
I
Jane,
play
pull up-
piano, though. I do play piano.
Well, we don't have a piano
Jane,
here.
pull up that old thing and let's hear something.
Oh, okay.
Tell us a little bit about the song.
Well, this is. My husband asked me, well, what song are you going to do? Because I've been very fortunate. I've had a lot of songs recorded and had some hits and by people who can really sing, not me. But I am what's called a performing songwriter. And I decided I'm going to do the very, very first song I ever had recorded. And it was recorded by, I moved here from New York City, which is where I was born and raised. And
Down the street from the president.
Wow.
well, we're not going to get into that.
But she will get into that with Rob.
Got it.
And now you totally got me off track. Oh, right. So I totally, it's such unpleasant memories.
She literally grew up with that.
Right, all right. Okay. Anyway, okay, what? Oh, right. Oh, my God.
Back to your song.
Yeah, back to my song.
sorry.
No, anyway,
Sorry.
so I got signed to a publishing company very quickly when I moved down here. I moved here 37 years ago when the community was a lot smaller. Music community, there were hardly any of my species, being women, that were writing. And so they were always looking for girl songwriters. And so I was able to get a publishing deal very quickly. I was very fortunate. And one day my publisher came to me and he said, Janie, we love what you're writing, and you're a great R&B writer and you're a great rock writer and you write great pop songs, but you're not turning in any country songs, and we're here in Nashville. Jeez. And I said, well, I've never written a country song. So I wrote this, and I was very fortunate. It became my first cut, my first recording.
So who recorded
Miss Tammy Wynette. And so it was like, where do I go from here? But I was very fortunate to go many places
I have to ask
from
you
there.
this one question that
Sure.
was that songwriter. So you get this song recorded by Tammy Wynette. It obviously does okay. What did you buy?
Oh, no. That it didn't do anything at that point for me to buy anything.
Okay.
First song that I was able to say, yeah, this was financially, because that's what you're asking, right? was financially rewarding was a number one record. That was, where you see copious amounts of money at one time. Well, back in those days, everything was just terrestrial radio.
Yeah.
Now we do a lot of streaming and whatnot, and the money is negligible. It's really horrific. But, well, it is.
Because people used to say in this town that you could always tell when a songwriter's last big hit was by the age of their car.
Well, I don't know. I haven't had a big hit in a while, and I just got a new car, so. But
Go ahead. I'm dying to hear this.
okay, well, this is the wonderful thing about this. Not only because it was my first cut, what a wonderful thing when you get first song recorded. It's like, oh my gosh, and it was recorded by Demi Wynette. Are you kidding?
Yeah.
But I don't know. You're young, but the Jordanaires, who used to be Elvis Presley's backup singers.
Oh, I thought those were Michael's kids.
No, the Jordanaires. They were phenomenal.
there you go.
They were actually gospel singers who, there were 4 of them, and just phenomenal. And they sang backup on this song, and anyway, it's called After Dark. This was my impression of a country song. There you go. After dark, like the shadows we fall in love like the first time and no time at all, making up for the hours that we've been apart, and we come together in love after dark. 5:30 comes early and we've both got jobs to do. All of this overtime leaves little for me and you. We got bills on the table, but there's love in our hearts. We're living the good life in love after dark. Hey, after dark, like the shadows we fall in love like the first time in no time at all, making up for the hours that we've been apart, and we come together in love after dark. Second verse. From sun up to sundown, the work never stops. It takes all we get just to keep what we've got. Yeah, we could sure use the money from a late shift or two, but if I'm gonna moonlight, I'm gonna moonlight with you. Hey, after dark, like the shadows we fall in love like the first time and no time at all, making up for the hours that we've been apart, and we come together in love after dark. You gotta clap now, come on. After dark, like the shadows we fall in love like the first time in no time at all, shake it, making up for the hours that we've been apart, and we come together in love after dark, yeah. after dark, yeah. There we go.